Let's now move on to the Spanish Civil War. And why do I choose to devote the third segment of this lecture on the Spanish Civil War? Because it became, as I said earlier, a rallying point of the forces of anti-fascism, and also Franco's regime was closely aligned to fascism and Nazism, although not quite being a fascist regime in the manner that Italy was, or a Nazist regime in the manner of what Germany was. Let me give you a bit of historical background on Spain. Uh, Probably not many of you, I suspect, know facts about Spanish history. In 1873, after the Italian unification, Spain becomes a constitutional monarchy, but instability rules. Italy is also a constitutional monarchy, by the way. Um, Spain in 1898, Spain loses its last American colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico. You know, Spain in the early modern period, before the 19th century, Spain was this big seafaring empire, but at the time we're talking about, towards the early 20th century, it is no more. During the First World War, Spain remains neutral and uh, and has the rather convenient role of actually selling arms to both sides. Uh, Spain is gripped in 1918 by, and in the times we live in, I should say, quite eerily familiar, the Spanish influenza, which causes massive economic and social crisis. Um, and a few years later, in 1923, there is a military coup by a military general and aristocrat that essentially puts an end of some period of parliamentary government. Um, the outbreak of the economic crisis in 1929 uh, leads to social unrest in Madrid. In other words, the people uh, revolt over their dictator. And in 1930, marks 1930, the year 1930 marks the end of the dictatorship, of the Primo de Rivera dictatorship in uh, Spain. And in the early 30s, there is the so-called Second Republic of Spain that's being proclaimed. After following a plebiscite, uh, there is a new republic that comes into being. The king is exiled, and this new republic brings in a new republican democratic constitution. And this is quite interesting because in the 30s, early 30s, Spain seems to be following a different trajectory than what other nation states in Europe are following, whereas authoritarianism prevails. In the early 1930s in Spain, there seems to be a republican movement that is based on the principles of secularization. It's anti-Catholic. Um, However, this also provokes the revolt, rather, or the serious um, provokes many military generals to have serious considerations about the course that the country is taking, and there is instability in the army. The problem, though, the challenge and the problem in Spain in this period is that uh, there is, although we have new democratic governments, there is still an element of parliamentary instability in the country. The governments that are elected and manage Spain's affairs in the early 30s don't quite have enough popular support. Uh, and we get to the milestone period of 1936. Um, what happens in 1936? And again, to give you a sense of the timeline, we are here 3 years after the ascent of Hitler into power in Germany. We are 7 years from the global economic crisis. We are incidentally the same year where in Greece, a dictator and a new authoritarian movement who tries to emulate some of the fascist principles comes into being. There are elections in Spain in 1936, and they are won, these elections, by a left-wing coalition of socialists and Republicans, together with communists and anarchists, which is called Frente Popular, Popular Front. However, the problem at the time was that the parliament and society was very polarized and there was no coherent political center. The political discussion, the setup of the political, the formation of the political parties had moved to the different opposing sides of the spectrum. And we do then have at the same time right-wing military and paramilitary groups, such as the Falang, to assassinate key liberal figures. Some of the leaders some of the representatives of the politicians and the established political leaders in Spain try and form a Republican government. However, the Republican government is too weak and it doesn't quite achieve the support of the socialists. The key power holders, Catholics and monarchists, enjoyed the support of the army. And this is a very important thing to note. And here enters a very influential figure who indeed becomes the dictator of Spain for more than close to 4 decades, General Francisco Franco. He is at the time a commander-in-chief of the Spanish army, a monarchist and a conservative in ideology. He opposes the Republican government in Spain, and he essentially, in a polarized landscape, leads a coup. By coup I mean, overthrows the government that is trying to establish its grip onto power. Tries to form, after the new elections, the Popular Front, they try to form a new government and create stability in a rather unstable political landscape. And Franco leads a movement of army officers that effectively put an end to that. However, unlike other places like Greece, like Portugal, the coming into power of Franco's movement leads to a protracted civil war. Why? Why do we have in Spain a civil war and not in other places where, for instance, authoritarianism and dictatorship prevails? The military coup that Franco and others are after didn't quite have a clear outcome. Although the distraction of the opponent became, so this means that the distraction of the opponent became the primary objective. The opponent was this assortment of different radical left-leaning groups. No political faction opposed the violence and the atrocities or even defended the stability. And at the same time, there were great cultural and political divisions within the Spanish landscape, political and cultural landscape. There was widespread violence, and at the same time, the international intervention and the support that Franco received from Germany, specifically, and at the same time, the pouring into Spain of anti-fascists from across Europe prolonged an already difficult conflict. And in the end of the day, the Spanish Civil War became something like a war of ideologies, if we might say. On the one end, we had the Republican faction, who were pro-secularization, were anti-clericals, were pro-democracy, included a lot of trade union leaders, workers, socialist revolutionaries. So we have a kind of a heterogeneous group, but agreeing on some core principles such as democracy, political representation, the rights of the working class, and the proclamation of the principles of secularism and democratic rule. On the other end, what we have in the Spanish Civil War, the other opposing end, and in fact the end that ended up winning the war, we had monarchists, conservative people who saw Catholicism as a value to be cherished and the principles of Catholicism, nationalists that spoke with pride about how Spain was one of the best countries in the world, military leaders, and this kind of ideological framework had a big foothold in the army. Also, entrepreneurs and industrialists. Franco was successful in creating alliances with those in real economic and political power. Another reason why the Spanish Civil War is important is not only because it provoked, for instance, in Britain there was a lively discussion as to whether Britain should intervene on the side of the fighting Republicans. And many made the point, well, why is it that we upheld the neutrality of Belgium and we opposed German aggression during the First World War? Why is it now that we do not intervene in Spain and help those fighting for democracy, those fighting for political rights over against the forces of darkness, the forces of Catholicism and essentially dictatorial rule? The answer, so there was a lively debate at the time, 1936-37. The answer by many was that, well, this is a different matter because it is the case of a civil war within a state. There's no act of aggression that Spain has done over some other country that would then render legitimate an intervention. But that said, there were a number of left-leaning people, socialists of one shade or another, from various parts of Europe, including Britain and France, that actually poured into Spain to help the cause of the Republicans and to fight against the forces of Franco, the forces of fascism, essentially. And that has a lasting influence, these memories of this war, into European culture. And in the British case, here I just mentioned some names: George Orwell, the photographer Robert Capa, Paul Eluard, Ernest Hemingway, the French poet André Malraux, even the philosopher Simone Weil. They all kind of were engaged, and many of them went and fought on the side of the Republicans in Spain. Another key important here is that most of them were convinced, key point rather, was that most of them were convinced that fascism was an international threat and that Spain was the right venue to combat it. So Spain becomes this kind of, how to put it, prelude to what was to come later in the early 40s. And many people foresaw that. And many people and intellectuals, and not only, thought that the outcome of the civil war in Spain will effectively determine whether the forces of progress or of darkness will prevail in Europe. And here, just to give you a sense of how this conflict kind of evolves and then ends, Britain, US, and France signed an agreement of non-intervention, leading to an arms embargo. That was as far as they were willing to go. The USSR initially became neutral, then supported the Republicans together with Mexico. Mussolini and Hitler supported Franco and provided ammunition and money for political and strategic reasons. 32,000 international volunteers fought on the Republican side, and indeed died in different parts of Spain, and a lot of them were British. And the civil war was characterized by ferocious violence, targeting the enemy as non-human, frequent use of mass gassing, systematic torture, etc., was made by General Franco against his own people, specifically. Here I'd like to bring this segment to an end by just giving you a quick overview, and I will pull up this slide on what we have so far covered, the ground we have so far covered. And well, I don't quite see a slide, but anyway, I will proceed even without one. What did we do in this lecture? We started discussing the other side of the Roaring Twenties, how gradually the continent fell prey to the sirens of authoritarianism. We discussed a different kind of authoritarian movements that we have in Europe at the time, ranging from regimes that are simply quote unquote simply dictatorial, to fascism and Nazism, and we discussed the differences between these two, and we discussed in greater detail the ideological and historical roots of fascism. And then in this segment, I gave you an overview of what happens in Spain in the mid to end of 1930s, and why the Spanish Civil War is important for the broader war against fascism and Nazism. Thank you.